related. Okay, not unrelated to my Locus Ludi project on the fabric of play and games, because in one of the modules, yes, one of the modules, we discuss how interact education and knowledge, and it is within the words themselves. Schole meaning leisure and school, or ludus meaning entertainment and learning, and we will see today how it can work, how knowledge transmission was achieved also through public display, private display, having to do with fun and learning learning very strange things with fun. So let me start with the presentation of what is teratology, because I will address this question. I would like to revisit this idea of a linear view of progress in the history of science, especially about teratology. And I will take teratology as an example, going back to the view that was made in the 19th century and has been going on until even today in many books. And it was formulated by two famous French anatomists, first Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, the father, and then Isidore Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire. Isidore being the one who published these 3 volumes that are really a standard in the history of monsters, the general and particular history of anomalies of organization in man and animals, 3 volumes. He coined the word teratology after the Greek word teras used among others by Aristotle in the generation of animals, we will come back to that, to define a monstrosity that belongs to the class of things contrary to nature. So I start with that volume because in that volume, Isidore Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire will not just coin teratology as a science, so the science about abnormal bodies, but he will also coin an image of where is the past compared to other periods. And this, the description I take from the British and Foreign Medical Review, 1839, where it is summed up how Isidore is describing it. So first we have antiquity, the fabulous period with tales, inaccurate description, absurd, superstitious prejudices. Of course, we have Hippocrates and others, but nevertheless, there is no real global vision until the 18th century. Then we have a pre-scientific period until 1820, where in place of explanation admitted to by the superstition of a preceding period, there is an endeavor to substitute scientific and reasonable theories. And then since 1820, and it is the time where Isidore, Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire comes in, monsters become object of science in their own right. They are named and classified from anatomical data. And I show you the Histoire des monstres of Ernest Martin, which is a standard book, which reproduces the same thing. I don't show you recent works, but some recent works still allude to and still mention and refer to that construction. And this construction, this is what I want to show, does not work, because in fact there is no such clear-cut division between antiquity and between the 18th century, the 1820s, the pre-scientific period. It's much more subtle, and this is what I would like to address. And that structure, among the criteria used for that structure is the fact that when you reach the second stage, that of a pre-scientific period, there is a tool that is created to understand the monster, to understand the abnormal. It is either wax reproduction of these bodies or the bodies themselves. So there is a desire to preserve the memory for science of abnormal beings. And I show you the very first one. So the first steps, these wax anatomical models by Guillaume Denouet and Gaetano Zumbo, or by André-Pierre Pinson. And what is interesting is very often you have embryos, you have fetuses. Fetuses are very important for the history of teratology. So first stage, these wax models, unfortunately, most of them, or most of these pieces, which are art pieces, disappeared. For Guillaume Denouet, it was very important because it allowed to study anatomy, as he said, without the horror of dissections. So it had a very precise aim. So this wax cabinet more or less disappeared when the objects themselves. The second stage was preserving bodies. And so preserving bodies appears as something that dates to this second period, to understanding better anatomy. There were several attempts before Fredericus Rusch, who is Dutch anatomist, a well-known one. He was the most successful. He did almost 2,000 anatomical preparation. And what I would like to underscore, it is that you have at the same time the anatomy lesson by Professor Fredericus Rusch, so very scientific. And at the same time, we know he elaborated diorama, tableau with embryos. So fantastic landscapes made of kidney stones, bones, plants, and fetal skeletons. All of these disappeared, but we know them, fortunately, thanks to engravings. What is interesting, it is that Peter the Great was fan of that collection and he really wanted to buy it. So we'll think about it, how the elite and how the powerful wants to possess such items. And we know that he succeeded and that in 2017, the collection was sold to Peter the Great in St. Petersburg in the Kunstkamera, where you can still see some of his preparations using what Rusch called the liquor balsamicum, so mixture he had. A few pieces are left, but by people who adopted the same approach, like Jean-Joseph Suhr, this memento mori, using again skeletons of embryos. And these objects could also go into private collection in the famous cabinet of curiosities. So we have this tension between works done for scholars, for medical practitioners, and at the same time open to the public, entertaining the public by the same person, so from the same place. So what about antiquity? We are in a very similar tension, in fact, between medical professionals, lay people, and the king, the emperor. A series of written accounts, also some visual accounts, and one archaeological specimen that I will show you at the end relate to the preservation, circulation, exhibition of monstrous bodies, and so not of fantastic creatures, but allegedly of real creatures, and mainly, again, embryos, fetuses, newborn babies, and all kinds of places. These testimonies are very interesting because they clearly belong to the paradoxographical tradition that developed in the Hellenistic period. And the aim was precisely to educate as well as surprise the reader with curiosities of the nature. And so we will see how these curiosities have become part of education between the late Republic and the early empire. But first, let's see quickly what we have from Greece, from classical Greece. In classical Greece, in fact, we had very little information in medical treatises, though these medical treatises are so important. And maybe it has to do with the genre, with the literary genre, because a medical treatise is to treat. And the practitioner is just helpless. If there is a stillbirth, what can he do? There is nothing to do. So that's why maybe there was no particular comment. Just to show you two examples, in Hippocrates' Epidemics, he describes how a woman on the 40th day from the first, she had a flesh coming out. So there is just a word, a flesh. There is no attempt to observe it, to dissect it, or even to preserve it. We have a second description, it's a very famous one of an abortion of a woman who is a prostitute and she wants to get rid of the baby. And it dropped out like a piece of flesh. So we have again this expression, flesh, sarx. If you put this flesh into water and examine it in the water, you will see that it has all the parts. So what is interesting here, that there is an examination using water to do that, but again, there is no attempt to dissect, to preserve it. So this is for the classical Greece. Aristotle is, of course, our main source, because Aristotle is the ancient founder of teratology for us. And in The Generation of Animals, I quoted him at the start. What is a monstrosity for him? So it's something that belongs to the class of things paraphysine, contrary to nature, but immediately after he nuances that it's never completely contrary to nature. It is an exception, but nature is everywhere. One of the main elements for him in his category, and we will see them appear now, is first the person who does not look like ancestors, so first father and mother, but even has no more the appearance of a human being, but that of an animal only. And his view, we will see how it is repeated in the Roman world, is very interesting, because for him, one must beware. It is very difficult to have a real hybrid, because it is impossible, in fact, because there is a gestation period, as he describes here, as is shown by the gestation periods of man, sheep, dog, ox, which are widely different. So there is in no case it is possible to have a man with the head of another, of a calf, of an ox. This is not possible. But what is possible, it is another category, so it is to have additional parts to the body. And we see in his reports how he looks at animals to understand all these examples, among others, based on multiple births. When there are many offsprings, the offspring can hamper each other and produce monsters. And he goes on explaining how he watches foals, because they lay many twin eggs, and he has even somewhere some sort of statistics, how many twin eggs you get and how many monstrosities you get with twin eggs. It's quite funny. But again, his descriptions, though they are very, very interesting, that he has so twin eggs with twin eggs with chicks, with 4 legs and wings, 1 body and 1 head. One body and 1 head, and it is because it was not separated. It was a twin egg, so the white and the yolk were not separated, and then that's why they fused. That's why they fused. But no observation about man, human, only about animals. And these funny little chicks, well, he doesn't seem to have kept them, nor their skeleton, no whatever. Though there are few descriptions, like in Plutarch Pericles, we see the story of a one-horned ram brought to Pericles, and there Anaxagoras has cut the skull in 2 to understand what happened, and gives an explanation, but no other special treatment. When we have preservation of material, so it is bones, and it is by coincidence, in fact. And I have put you a number of examples. Here, Herodotus, about bodies of Plataeans, and one of them, there was a skull was found, of which the bone was all of one piece without suture. But it is just by chance, and we don't know where it was kept. Same for Pausanias, there was a crest away in a storm, broke away, and there appeared bones, the shape of which led one to suppose that they were human, but from their size, one would never have thought of it. And that's why they think of a giant Geryon. John Boardman has collected these stories in his Archaeology of Nostalgia, to show that instead it contributed to the creation of myth. And Adrien Mayer, of course, collected these as well and tried to show how it could be articulation indeed with myth, such as the griffin and the dinosaur, how they could explain each other. In fact, the earliest record of the desire really to keep the memory of monstrous beings, human, animal, or hybrid, date to the late Republican period. And it dates even to a time of Pompey the Great, who in his theater, constructed in 55 BC, had something very special as a decoration in his theater. And so we are more back in the wax stories, not the monster itself, but the image image of celebrated marvels, which is quite surprising at first. I mean, when you think of a theater and decoration, this is what he chose to do. And it was even made to purpose, made with special elaboration for the purpose. And what do we see there? Among them, we read of Eutychus, who at a trellis was carried to her funeral pyre by 20 children. So again, multiple birth being something extraordinary. She had given birth 30 times. And Alcippe, who gave birth to an elephant. Here are the reconstruction of the place. So it was in this portico that you could see these marvelous things. But interesting, because in fact, if we go on in the description, you don't see the child with the elephant. We see the mother. We see the mother. And Dasen, in his address to the Greeks, and he writes a little later, he writes in the 2nd century, he stayed in Rome during the reign of Antoninus Pius. He also described the statues of a quadriportico. There was 3 series of 7 statues of women with extraordinary fertility. So we found again Glaucippe, and we found again the one we saw before. So Glaucippe, because she bore a monstrous child. And his question, if she became pregnant with an elephant, what reason was there for Glaucippe to enjoy public honor? Because the place where they were exhibited is an interesting place. It was the first public park, in fact, of Rome. So anybody could come in and see Glaucippe, but you didn't see the child, you see the mother, you saw the mother. Then the other women, we know thanks to Tassia, Dinomenes, contrived that Besantis, queen of the Paeonians, should be remembered for his art. So we have the name of a sculptor because she bore a black child. And then you have the woman who had 30 children. In all that, and Gilles Sauron has well shown that there is an ideology behind all this, and this leads us to enter this world, this Hellenistic and Ptolemaic world, and with Alexandria. These elements were part for Pompey of an ideological dimension, showing that he was mastering, in a sense, the inhabited world, and all also until the edge of all that could exist. And it's quite interesting to see that the women contributed the most extraordinary things about what could exist. He wanted them to be in his place. And that's why the statue that was in the curia of a theater showed him holding the globe. So he's holding the globe as in his quadriportico, he had gathered all kinds of marvels coming from different parts of the world. He is the master already of his oikumene, and this was something very important. The story of elephants is intriguing. Why did he put there this woman who had an elephant child? And when we come closer to the choices, we see that these are topoi, these are topics that were much like. So for instance, the elephants since the Second Punic War, when we had Hannibal crossing the Alps in 2018 with his elephants, it was a trendy topic. It was a trendy topic, and Plutarch about Marcellus. We have a number of stories about children born with an elephant's head. So it was something trendy. But now the other creatures that arrived in Rome is the hippocentaur. And here we are in the time of Claudius, so a bit later, first half of first century AD. Claudius had written not memories, had written something, the treatise that is lost, of course, and reported by Pliny, who said that, so he had written that a hippocentaur was born in Thessaly and died the same day. So again, we have an unusual birth, and he died. And in his reign, we actually saw one that was brought here for him from Egypt, preserved in honey. So we have even 2 here, hippocentaur, for one anecdote in Pliny. And Pliny stresses that he saw it, but we don't know where he saw it, but it was visible, as we will see in the second example. The second example is Phlegon of Tralles, who wrote in the 2nd century AD. Maybe it's the same. He says Hippocentaur was found in Soun, a city in Arabia. So again, it is located in the far end of the world, on a very high mountain that teems with a deadly drug. And the Hippocentaur was captured alive by the king, who sent it to Egypt together with other gifts for the emperors. Again, the emperor is where the person to whom you must bring such things. But so he doesn't like the change of air, and it died. So that the prefect of Egypt embalmed it. So we had the story of the honey with the first one. It was brought here from Egypt preserving honey, and we have many stories about preserving thanks to honey. And this time it is embalmed in Egypt and sent to Rome. And here we have another information. It was exhibited in the palace. And again, an allusion to seeing it, because there is a very, very fine description. The face, 5 serve a human face, arms, fingers that were hairy, how the hooves looked like. So a very precise description of the specimen and how it was preserved. And Phlegon goes on saying that there have been other Hippocentaurs. So far as concerns the one sent to Rome, anyone who is skeptical can examine it for himself. Since I have said above, it has been embalmed and is kept in the emperor's storehouse. And this is a very interesting information. So there was a place, Horeum, open, where people could come and see. Again, the choice of a specimen is not any choice. It's again a topos. Just for pleasure, I show you in 1994 in Tennessee. It's a fake, of course, needless to say, but very nice. They invented the excavation of a centaur of Volos, and it was reconstructed. And this reconstruction here comes from the same event, but which is very nice. We know, so it was a very trendy topic because Lucien explains that this was a famous painting by Zeuxis, the female Hippocentaur feeding twin Hippocentaur children like babies, and that it was a marvel on this painting to see the union and junction of bodies whereby the horse part is fused. So I think it's no coincidence that we have this choice of specimen, and the memory of this painting may be kept in other pieces of art such as cameo, glass gems, where the artist was interested by the challenge to represent this mixture between female body and animal body, and what do you do with a child? I mean, the centaur child, which is also breastfeeding, which is also something very interesting. But Lucretius, and that's to say that this specimen travel are to be seen in Rome, but Lucretius, like Aristotle, says that this is not possible, for certainly no image of a centaur comes from one living, since there was never a living thing of this nature. And I don't have time here to deconstruct that. I'm sure that Dunstan is the best to elaborate on this. It is interesting to see how culturally you have specific types of specimens that were brought and shown, knowing that at the time of Plutarch, the elite, not just the most powerful, the emperor or the king, but just the elite liked to go to the monster market and buy people, real people who had physical defects, because they enjoyed it. And we can also come back to that later. Also, the making of abnormal people is something very interesting, or maimed persons. I don't go back to Seneca and his debates about how people maimed found children, abandoned children, so that they would beg. I just mentioned Pseudo Longinus, who mentions it is in a rhetorical treatise, but nevertheless he can mention such things. So it's not that it is true, but it is something you can conceive. In cages, they keep the pygmies or dwarfs, as they are called, stunt the growth of their prisoners. So I go to the next marvel, which is the Triton. The Triton that Pausanias says again that he saw himself. I saw a Triton among the curiosities at Rome. So you could go in Rome, you could go around and you could see, but where, we don't know, amazing things such as the Tritons. The Tritons have a following appearance. They have funny hair, but they look like a marsh frog. And then they have ears that are gills, a man's nose, and the mouth is broader, and there are teeth that are those of a beast. And many details. Eyes seems to me blue. They have hands, fingers, under the breast and belly is a tail like a dolphin's instead of feet. So this is something you could see in Rome. We could see in Rome. He mentions of another one where there is also that we have a Triton he mentions, and there is a whole story about this Triton was a wild animal and was killed. So I'm very sorry. I stop here with a Fiji mermaid, because when I was looking for what did this Triton look like, maybe it looked like the Fiji mermaid, which was really en vogue in the 19th century. It's even, as they say, a fake mermaid, a fake Fiji mermaid, because it was basically at the start a Javanese goddess, and then it went on traveling in Europe, being completely fake, a fake Fiji mermaid, so constructed, and I can show you because they made scans. So these are my pictures in London. It is in the Science Museum, so you can see the funny face, and and I'll let you think how it is made. It's a wonderful mixture, but the Triton of Rome probably look like that. So in the Horniman Museum, they made scans and they discovered there is a packing of fish jaws, fish skin, even chicken parts, really a total construction. What is interesting, it is that it went around Europe. It went around Europe at the time that Isidore Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire was writing his volumes about the history of teratology. Now we have another indication of places where you could see such marvels. It is in Pliny again. And Pliny says that in the time of Augustus or Claudius, there were two persons, 6 inches taller than 9 feet. So 9 feet, I calculated it's about 2 meters 60. So there is a giant, really a giant, whose bodies, on account of this remarkable height, were preserved in the tomb in Sallust gardens. Their names, of course, are funny, Pusio and Secundilla. When the same emperor was head of a state, the smallest person was a dwarf, 2 feet, so 2 feet about 70 centimeters high, named Conopas, the pet of his granddaughter Julia, and the smallest female was Andromeda, the freed woman of Julia Augusta. Marcus Varro states that the knights of Rome, so free people, not slaves, Manius Maximus and Marcus Tullius, were 3 feet high, and we have ourselves seen their bodies preserved in coffins. So where were they preserved? And in fact, when you put together these stories, you realize that you had gardens, as we had first the graduate portico of Pompeii. You had gardens where you could see such marvelous creatures. The Horti Luculliani we will see, and the Horti Sallustiani of Sallust. They are red and yellow on this map. Difficult to reconstruct because we are in modern Rome and near the Villa Medici, and so it's very difficult. But there are schematic reconstruction, and we know there was also an infirm, a theater, cryptoporticos, and you wonder where were these people kept that you could see these bodies. In the same place, you could see also the sleeping hermaphroditus, and that's why it is interesting to see that there are also visual evidence of this taste for the marvel, but also having to do with the scientific interest for these marvels. The Horti Luculliani are also reconstructed, where you could see these marvels. And again, you have the gardens, and we have sort of an nymphaeum. It was a sort of Disneyland, in fact. I mean, where you could go around and see these statues and see these unusual bodies. Augustus is the first emperor and the one who has a very interesting attitude towards this new trend. We know from Suetonius that in his villa he kept monstrous bones of huge sea monsters and wild beasts called the bones of giants and the weapons of the heroes, of course. And this is the kind of thing that Adrien Mayer, the kind of anecdote that Adrien has collected. What is interesting too is about this ambiguity of the position of Augustus is that he says that on the one hand, when something rare was brought to the city, he would exhibit it to the crowd. A rhinoceros, a tiger, a snake in front of a comitium or in the circus. But privately, he didn't like it. He didn't like it. So, for instance, he abhorred dwarfs, cripples, and everything of that sort as freaks of nature, of ill omen. So he really appears as a man between two worlds, a new one where you like to show these amazing animals, humans, and being a very traditional and conservative Roman who didn't like at all this kind of things. So where does this taste come from? It tastes from Hellenistic, from Ptolemaic Egypt. That's where we have most evidence. And that's where the relation to the abnormal bodies was transformed and become something else than what it was in Rome before, something beings that you would suppress, that you would kill. They become mirabilia, they become something you look for. Lucian, for instance, describes how Ptolemy II had a show where he had a camel, a black camel, and a man of two colors. So probably an albino. He was an albino. And he thought that the people would love it because the Alexandrians were very difficult and they liked to be surprised. But in fact, they were afraid. And the people disliked it. And which was a bit of a surprise also for Ptolemy. And other sources relating to Alexandria are to be found in Philodemus. In Philodemus, there is a discussion, there is a debate, and during that debate, there is a description of what could be seen in Alexandria. The man in Alexandria, half a cubit high. Half a cubit high means about 20 centimeters. That's why I think it was either a newborn child, not just an anthropos. It was probably a newborn child with a young child with a colossal head. So it was even a case of hydrocephaly. But look at what was done. So here there is a show, but the show is made by a private person. We don't know where, we don't know how exactly, but we know that this man did something. It could be beaten with a hammer, who used to be exhibited by the embalmers. So we have the association of the embalmers, and sometimes they would show, probably for money, pieces, interesting specimen they had. And there is also the mention of the pygmies that they show in Achoris, who are quite similar to those which Antony recently brought from Syria. So Antony is another person who had a very clear taste for such things. For me, what is very interesting is that this taste that is born clearly in Alexandria is not born anywhere. Of course, there is this figure of the king. And again, as with Pompey, because Pompey is clearly also influenced by this trend. The king, the Ptolemies, we know they had kinds of zoo also in Alexandria, where they collected all the marvelous animals. But there is another point. It is that in Alexandria, you had medical schools, and Galen mentioned something which should be investigated further. Galen says that to a young medical doctor, you should endeavor to study, to know each bones, and to know them, but with your own eyes. This is quite easy at Alexandria because the physician there employ ocular demonstration in teaching osteology to students. For this reason, if for no other, try to visit Alexandria. And he gives an example of what do you do if you don't have something like that, when you wait by chance to see somebody who has not been buried and leaving the skeleton as if for demonstration. So I'm quite convinced that in Alexandria you had preparations of bodies, and that's why you have these stories of a Hippocentaur, of a Triton that come from Egypt to Rome, but also of bodies and of skeletons. So that's just a hint to this larva convivialis that we know that was shown in banquets, a tradition also coming from Egypt. But when you look at such depictions, it looks terribly like a skeletal preparation. And maybe that's what Galen alludes to. And I show you a few other pieces. The lamp, where you have a man looking at a skeleton, or if this is of course Prometheus, but Prometheus is almost building a skeleton as you would do it if you make a preparation for teaching. And here you have a philosopher, and a philosopher can also be a doctor, looking again at the preparation, probably a preparated skeleton. And I will end with Phlegon of Tralles, where he mentions again that the Dr. Dorotheus, probably Dorotheus of Hermopolis, in his memoir, in his Hypomnemata, says that in Egyptian Alexandria, a male homosexual gave birth, and that because of a marvel, the newborn infant was embalmed and is still preserved. So again, we have this story of preserving, but here we wonder, did the doctor ask for it to be preserved? So are we in this circle of medical doctors who had specimen they really wanted to keep? And to end, I just saw these terracottas. I didn't want to address them, but they come also from places where there were medical schools, but with the same tension between entertainment, because they are exaggerated facial features, for instance, but at the same time, unusual anatomy. So again, marvelous people, marvelous depictions that are a source of entertainment, but also of instruction. My final document is a real one. And this real one, in fact, has nothing to do with demonstration. It comes from Hermopolis. Hermopolis is here. It is the necropolis of the monkeys. And so we are back to Isidore. Because Isidore and Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, especially Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, was presented a very strange mummy coming from Hermopolis by Passalacqua, who was an explorer and a funny guy, but made nice finds in Hermopolis. And Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, when he unwrapped the mummy, discovered that it was not a monkey, and maybe that's what suspected Passalacqua, but was one of the monstrosities of a human species which I had been able to study, and so-called anencephale. So this plate in Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire is the piece found in Hermopolis to illustrate this volume. And so one of these marvels is one of the key document in the history of teratology, because it arrived in the hands of the most famous anatomist, Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire. And there was a hanging pendant of a baboon, and for Geoffroy it was very clear this child was thought of as being a monkey. I have no time to elaborate on this, but just to know that this had disappeared, and I'm very happy to have found it again, well, in pieces, of course, in small pieces, but in Berlin. And thanks to Armand Leroy, with whom I wrote a paper about this piece. And in fact, what we showed in our papers, and I went on developing that, is that this child was not considered as a hybrid being, but more placed under the protection of Thoth, who is a god patronizing regeneration, like the wedged eye that he regenerates. And the frog aspect has to do also with the Ogdoad, so the birth of creation. And hence, I conclude here with this very extraordinary piece going back to Isidore and Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire and to the history of teratology. If I want to sum up, what is important, I think, is to realize that the figure of the monster occupies a very special place in the history of transmission of knowledge in the Hellenistic and Republican era. Of course, it is very important the time when Etienne and Isidore Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire coined teratology, coined anencephaly. However, we can see that other principles govern the relationship with these non-standard beings in antiquity, that there was the conservation already in antiquity of bodies, not just the image, and that this conservation was mixed at the same time with pleasure, with entertainment, but also with teaching, most likely also with teaching. But the boundaries are fluid, as we have seen, with the Mirabilia, with the Hippocentaur, with the Triton. But I wish so much we would find remains of such bricolage that were brought to Rome. But they were very important for the emperors and for the kings because they participated to this vision of the oikomene, the inhabited world, where all could happen as described by Aristotle. And just to finish, I show you pictures that I found so beautiful made by Francesco Sambo, who has a great website with his fantasies about hybrid beings that makes us think of how it can work or not work, and of Patricia Piccini, the young family, so you can work out yourself what works or not among these things, because these fantasies still go on. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Véronique. That was indeed wonderful. Thank you. Dasen, would you like to start?
I would love to, yes. Well, first of all, I think the important thing to say is thank you very much for an extremely rich selection of materials of all kinds, really. It was a really a wonderful synthesis, not only of different ancient cultures, but also of different types of evidence, including osteoarchaeology, art history, and of course, literature and historical texts. Even with Philodemus, we have papyri. So it was a wonderful synthesis, and the kind of thing that can only, well, it can't fail to stimulate a rich discussion. And the only reason why that wouldn't happen is because we're on a screen. And I have to say that the last time I was in a conference online, there was a remarkable gulf between the quality of the questions and the frequency of them. People were very shy of asking questions, and I was too. So yes, so I'm not going to promise that there'll be lots of questions, but I think people will definitely have them in their own heads, even if they don't make it into the screen or indeed onto the microphone. So the first thing to say is thank you very much, Véronique, for a stimulating talk. I think the important thing to do with a response like this is to be brief and to, rather than indulge in my own opinions, is to try to open up some wider questions for the discussion. And there are many directions in which this could be pursued. A couple of arbitrary thoughts before I try to raise bigger questions. First of all, that last image that came up, I absolutely love. I think these the same artist has a number of other artworks in a similar vein, and they're really they're challenging but really fascinating. And I think in particular of the ancient images of the breastfeeding centaur, the written account of apparently a seminal image, and then of course others that appear to be reflections of it. I'll come back to that shortly, but I just wanted to say that it's a stunning modern example of that same curiosity. And the other thing I wanted to say was that I've got no idea what this this anvil-headed body was about in Alexandria. I don't know what to think of that. I'd love to hear other people's theories about this, the hammering of the head. I don't know what's going on there, whether it's playfulness or some kind of feature of the body they're trying to highlight. I'm really at a loss there, which is a very pleasant place to begin. Okay, so here's a few more specific questions. One in particular it concerns the relationship between the dead and the alive when it comes to displays of bodies in antiquity. Some examples that were discussed were artworks which bring the original body to life in a highly mediated form. And we could say the same thing of the tombs, the ones in Rome that were mentioned, tombs with bodies that weren't, they were extraordinary, but perhaps eccentric rather than unheard of. And I wonder whether the display of the body in public could have been done at all in a genuine way, even as bones. But maybe again, we're talking about representations of the deceased on the tomb. But it could well be that the real body, the real bones were there, like the medieval examples in monasteries.
Yeah.
But my thought on that was that it's natural to connect the display of bodies with modern exhibits that were intended as marvels. And the examples of the centaurs and the triton are clearly ancestors of the Fiji mermaid, things that were intended for amazement, and certainly curiosity. But there are also some examples we've discussed, especially the ones from Alexandria involving skeletons, in which the whole point is that they are normal skeletons, that you could look at them and you would know what the real, what to expect from an actual living body. And I suppose what fascinates me is the idea that the technologies of bodily preservation and perhaps the habits of display at Alexandria were the real export, and that perhaps even the interest in abnormal bodies at Alexandria, including this strange large-headed small body, could have been marginal at Alexandria, but mainstream elsewhere, especially at Rome. So I guess it's about modes of curiosity. We think of Alexandria as a place where curiosity was arranged into what we would consider as science or like a science, and perhaps more objective and less aesthetic than elsewhere. And that's certainly borne out by this example of the black camel and the black and white person, who were imported to Egypt by Ptolemy for the Egyptians, and which they did not get at all. They didn't like it. So perhaps there's an aesthetic contrast between Egypt and Rome and the rest of the world that's particularly striking. Even the earlier Greek examples seem very different.
Yeah.
I realize I'm actually rambling on, and I said that I shouldn't do that. I should try and link it to questions then. I was really interested in the distinctiveness of Alexandria. Just to say a bit more about that, the ancient display of marvels. It's as you said in your opening remarks, it can be a imperializing thing. It can be a tool of a kind of a powerful display.
Yeah. And
this idea of an aristocrat sending or being sent human marvels and animal marvels is part of that. So we could think of the polis wanting its temple to have something remarkable to see, or maybe even the bones of a real hero, and then the Hellenistic aristocrat, the Ptolemy or the Porus indeed, finding places to send or to keep these remarkable things, remarkable living bodies in particular, and then the Roman nobleman as part of that same tradition, again doing it slightly differently. And I was wondering whether there was any analog in other material forms for the soft anatomical remains that of which we had several illustrations being displayed either in public as like I said, as memorials, or in semi-public places like this Horeum or the Teraton Agora, or whatever these other things refer to. I suppose the real challenge here is to find something like that. And you mentioned Augustus. Augustus is famous for this Solarium Augusti, which is a piece of Egypt, an obelisk set up in a new function as a memorial to himself, or part of a memorial complex, a giant sundial. And it struck me that the sundial casts a shadow on a pavement with bronze letters in it that shows you the date. But the writing is all in Greek. And I think that's a really concrete reminder that Rome itself, even in the early imperial period, is a Hellenistic state that just lived longer than the rest of them did.
Yes.
It may not have been Greek speaking primarily, but it became very culturally Hellenistic before the Republic was over. And I think yes, well, I'll go back to the modes of curiosity for a moment. And the terras is, of course, a stimulus for a different mode of curiosity, which is philosophical. The whole ontological question of how these things could be, whether they are is the first question, and then whether they should be, or whether they will be again, and so on. The mode of curiosity involving the centaur in art, and I never thought about this before, but I now realize is itself anatomical. Yes. And the breastfeeding centaur is an anatomical curiosity. Yeah. And it's not just about the weird sort of misogynistic metaphor of the nubile woman as a filly, as a horse that is unbroken. And in fact, Lucian does mention that very thing when he describes how beautiful the thing is. But it's actually, it's also physiological. It's a curiosity about the function of breastfeeding, and not just in horses, perhaps also in women. And the whole female reproduction aspect of teratogenesis in these monuments is, I think, is ever present. And maybe we shouldn't overstress it, but in images like that, I never thought about it. There's a dimension of perhaps almost a sexuality in the beautiful half horse that's also a breastfeeding mother. I'm going to list a couple more comments which will lead to questions, I promise, in the end. I just want to say about Alexandria. It's not necessarily the same as Egypt. So we've seen the reaction of the Egyptians to what Ptolemy showed them. And I suppose you could say that on one hand, they might have represented the Alexandrian view, but you could also say they weren't really yet being Alexandrians. The melting pot of Alexandria made it progressively different from Egypt as a province. And it's easy to list reasons why it was different. I mean, it was administrated slightly separately. It had a significant Jewish population. It was the seat of government for Macedonian pharaohs who spoke Greek and mostly didn't speak Egyptian at all. It had this strange religious profile, including Serapis, who's a culturally hybrid Greco-Egyptian deity. You may even say one that was engineered for political purposes. And then finally, of course, it had the Museon and its Bibliotheca, which were intended as powerhouses of Hellenic culture, radiating out their Greek cultural power into Alexandria, which is what they were intended to do. So all of these things set it apart from the province of Egypt, which is where the Nile is, or most of it, where the wet, fertile mud is hot, and all these extraordinary forms of life coming out. And you have hippopotami and crocodiles, and that Egypt, at least when some people describe it, perhaps Pliny the Elder describes it, it is like India, or like what he calls Africa. It's a place where things are very exotic and not cultured at all. And Alexandria's culturedness even extended to anatomical knowledge, proto-science, in an entirely unique way. It may be the excuse me, it could be the interaction between Alexandria and the places where these things are attributed to, Saone and I think excuse me. I think the dwarves that Philodemus mentions are also in Egypt, aren't they? They're in Achoris. These are places in the world that are nature without limit, fertility without any taming, and it's maybe a symptom of the economic and social conditions of Alexandrian imperialism and then later Roman imperialism, that these things comes from elsewhere and are imported, commodified, and so things go into Alexandria, or perhaps better, into the grip of the Ptolemies, rather than from Alexandria, the way that the culture of the skeleton had developed and emerged. Well, this is really fascinating stuff, and I have so little expertise that I'm just glad people have the patience to listen to me talk. But I suppose my questions will therefore be, in conclusion, how do the dead things on display compare with the live ones? And that's not just animals, but also humans and also animal-human hybrids. And does that have anything to do with Alexandria? The display of a live wonder. And then another question is, are these anatomical specimens really comparable to a cabinet of curiosities? The Wunderkammer in the I suppose Renaissance to early modern sense, where we have basically the equivalent of a paradoxography. We have to kind of jump from the paradoxography in Hellenistic literature forward to the genuine collection of rarities. I suppose the only real collection, the only miscellany that we could point to is the stuff that Augustus had on Capri, as you referred to, and even that was well, Suetonius says it's the bones of monsters which people call the bones of heroes, and I wonder whether Augustus would have called them monsters at all, or whether he would have said, these are the bones of heroes, look at all the heroes I have and all their ancient weapons. We've lost that essential element of show and tell, which is the narrative attached to the object, which is the point at which we learn what the mode of curiosity really is. Yes. But it is definitely clear that there were a range of them, and I guess I'm just trying to map them onto geography in perhaps an impossible way. But I'm just curious, do you think that there is a true cabinet of wonders, and do you think that Alexandria really liked living marvels or just dead ones? Those, I guess, would be my two main questions.
Yes, thank you. I think Alexandria had an immense impact. We know that had an immense impact on Roman culture, and through the history of teratology, we can point a few of these elements, how it worked. For instance, it transformed completely, and you know it well, the relation that the traditional Roman had to abnormal births, or this analytic tradition that it was fearful and so on. It changed completely. Then you bring in tritons, you bring in hippocentros, and you have pleasure to see. Alexandria, we know for medical history, is a crucial place. It's a meeting and melting pot between different traditions, the relation to the dead body that you embalm. Of course, you don't know what is inside when you embalm, but you touch a corpse, however, and you do things that you wouldn't do in Greece, that you wouldn't do in Rome. And that's where they could produce by embalming such things. So the impact of Alexandria is at two levels. Basically, this relation to these marvels, how it modified the traditional religious feelings, the Roman ones, and And so the display of wonders, living or dead, both, 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 and the history of Lucien. There are discussions whether Lucien has invented also the story, yeah, to ironically to say how far they could go, but it didn't work, that people didn't like it. We never know. It's a discourse, huh? It's not a newspaper report. So maybe it's just a discourse that he has. And Stefano Caneva speaks about it, with this perception of divine power and royal power in Alexandria. And Jean Trinquier, about the living beings, had done a very interesting work trying to localize where these animals were kept, these fantastic animals that were collected intentionally for display, for amusement. And we know that Alexandria was reputed as a very special place, melting pot of people, of traditions, and so this high impact. So as well as for the living as for the dead, and for the dead, it's because they could touch the dead, they could do things with the dead, and that's from there that comes probably these imports, this circulation of preparation. For me, it was very important to discover that these anatomical preparations existed in antiquity, but with a mixed configuration. It's not the way we do, but that's why I showed Frédéric Huich and his anatomical preparation. He was a scientist, but at the same time, he did entertaining constructions with his diorama. And I could show you Günther von Hagen's today, Body World.
Yes.
What is Body World?
Yes.
If you go on his website, I have a few pictures, but I don't like him at all. That's why I didn't show him first. But I found even players, players. No, Body World is terrible. But the intention that he gives is that we want to educate the public about what is inside. We want to prevent health care. So we have something in coexisting. And today, when we see what happens with pandemia, that there are not only rumors, but really creation of myth in the same 21st century. So I think that what was done, not by the embalmers, but the story of Dorotheus, I found very interesting. There, maybe we touch the history of a doctor who wanted to keep something for himself, for study. And that's something that we didn't know, in fact. And then that's why I went on with the skeletons that were probably prepared, because also we know sacred laws in Greece, in Kos, for instance, where you shouldn't touch bones. That's something, it's not that it is impure, it's more complex. But in Alexandria, this was possible. And for me, that's why Galen says, go to Alexandria. You will see things you will never see elsewhere. But because this is not something you speak about, he does not say it very clearly. And that's something I'm investigating, in fact, and I go on collecting if you find more. But in fact, I found quite a lot. And nobody had really realized that the seated philosopher, he's not just reflecting about life and so on, but he could be a doctor looking at a prepared skeleton. So that's why all this story of circulation of this prepared body, preserved bodies, also include this circulation of knowledge. And not just, and so maybe it's contiguous with scientific reflections, much more than we think. But in a way of learning that includes also entertainment, as in the paradox graphical tradition. It must be a surprise, it must be something exceptional, but you learn at the same time. So it's a way of learning that we still have, that was promoted then.
Thank you. Yes, I think I fell into the trap with Lucien of being too desperate to believe the evidence that is real. I mean, evidence, the sources are, I mean, I'm happy to do this with every other type of literature, but when it comes to anecdotes about monsters, in the past, I'm just so desperate for data that I think, oh, Lucian says this happens. So obviously he's documenting what the Alexandrians said centuries before in an authentic way, even though he's Lucian.
But you know, when you work on teratology, what is extraordinary, if you open a handbook of teratology, you realize that everything exists. So what you consider is impossible, no, it is possible.
Okay.
So
Yes.
who knows?
Oh, thank you.
So I'm sure there are lots of questions. John raised his hand. Yeah, you can either raise your hand and ask the question yourself, okay, or type it and we can ask it for you. So first John, then Dimitra, and then Sophia.
Thank you, George. That was a super presentation, Veronique. Absolutely magnificent. And so too Dunstan's response. Lots of thoughts come to mind, and I'd just like to pick up one strand of what you were talking about, and that is, I think it was in the Dasen text. There was a phrase, "De mosia timere," public honor. So in this, I think it was in Pompey's Theatre, in this place, it wasn't just spectacular and a sort of Disney world. Somebody Dasen was reporting on, had a sort of, this is an honorable thing, this is public honor.
Yeah.
And thinking through that positive sort of spin on what Dasen seems to be saying, you had in the Philodemus, you had the giant person from Crete, amongst other terata, and that's so close to the bones of Orestes in Herodotus and the dispute between Tegea and Sparta about who should have the bones of Orestes. And that wasn't for display, that was for really serious political religious purposes. Whoever has the bones is going to have greater power. It's a different culture, but it's the same phenomenon, but not in an entertaining way.
Yeah.
And similarly, when you had the passage from Galen, and you were talking so much about Alexandria, and Dunstan was saying, what a wonderful place of display it is. Absolutely. But that is where anatomy comes from. That's where dissection comes from. And that is why Galen's medicine is so much better than Hippocrates' medicine, because he hasn't seen the structures within the body, but people in Alexandria have. And that's a world-changing event in human knowledge, or in the West anyway, which is, it's a display, but it's not entertainment. It's deadly serious. This is what a human being is. So behind all this cabinet of curiosity stuff and rich people showing their power and their understanding of the world, there is also religion. There is, or had been in other contexts, key medical knowledge and key religious power in the case of Orestes.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I agree.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think it's Dimitra, right?
Yes, this is right. Good evening. Professor Dasen, thank you very much for this very elaborated speech. I really appreciate it. I do not claim the title of an expert in paradoxography nor a specialist, although I have completed my PhD in Paris Nanterre University, and I have made a translation of Pseudo-Antigonus. So all this archaeological evidence were very much useful for paradoxographical studies. My question is a little bit philological, and it concerns readership. We know in paradoxography, in Greek paradoxography, that readership is a gray area. It is, all paradoxographical treatises are more or less playful. Educated readers can read them. Less educated readers can read them too. Do we have any evidence about what you showed us from the medieval texts, and mostly about Geoffrey Saint-Hilaire? Do we have any evidence about the wonder response the public of medieval times Did they enjoy this kind of literature or not?
Difficult, huh? That's difficult.
It's difficult, yes, I know. I suppose we do not have much
No.
evidence to.
No, about public response, we have little bits like the passage I showed about Lucien and the Ptolemies and the display and the people didn't like. But otherwise, one question I had also for myself, it is who could enter the gardens of Sallustius? Who could go to Lucullus' gardens? Where was it really something public, or I cannot imagine that. Or you had to be yourself part of the elite and invited, and maybe at night when you had finished the dinner, you could go and see one of the dwarf embalmed in a niche. I don't know. But these are real questions. We have to go on looking for these little bits, because usually this information appear in the corner of a demonstration of a discourse. It's not in a treatise. It's always in the secondary.
Yes, in the margin, and it's the same for the medieval text that you showed us. Pretty much the same.
Yes, I didn't explore the medieval text, so I'm sure you can find experts about it. But it's just it's a question of audience. But with objects like these ones, we also have a question. I mean, because they mix the same. I mean, you can analyze them as anatomies, whatever hydrocele or how.
Totally.
But we see that there is a distortion at the same time. And who owned these? And with terracotta, we are closer to your question, because terracotta are cheap. These are not like the marmor hermaphrodite, and but the intention behind, and we know that it is that they also award evil eyes. So again, we find a picture of relation to these unusual bodies that is very, very culturally complex. But there we may touch a use that goes beyond just elite, but also perhaps bourgeois people, so wealthy people. Luca Giuliani wrote about these. Just to give you a hint, I like him so much. That's a Corinthian terracotta, and it's something just amazing. It is kept in Geneva Museum, and it is clearly so what we call hemimelia. It can be congenital, and here is not. There was the will to preserve the memory of an exceptional person. Unfortunately, there is no context. It was found and given to a medical doctor who was staying in Sicily, so most likely comes from a tomb. And we know that in ancient Sicily there were medical doctors, very well-known medical schools. So again, we could think, but this is a piece exceptional, 6th century. There is nothing equivalent in late. We must wait until the Hellenistic period and the terracotta I've shown you, which are more complex to analyze.
Okay, thank you very much. I much appreciate. Thank you.
It's Sophia now, and then Karina.
Hello, thank you very much. Most of that I know nothing about, and it was absolutely fascinating. I've done some work on Aristotle and monsters, and I think this comment's going to be a bit orthogonal to your presentation, but Dunstan gave me the courage to say something. So Aristotle does mention some deformities in humans. He says the male embryos are more likely to get deformed because they get knocked about. They're more active in the womb, apparently, than female embryos. Yes. And he says that he calls the kind of deformity of the genital parts, which causes infertility, he calls that a kind of deformity in humans. And he mentions a hermaphrodite once. But you're quite right, there isn't anything quite so fantastical as these later ideas. But he does think that there are animal hybrids. Mm-hmm. And it's not only the gestational period, but he's not going quite as wild and crazy as the later people, because he says they have to be similar in form. Yeah. So he's got kind of like dogs and foxes and things that are kind of near each other having these. But he does say, I wondered if, maybe this is a question about your presentation about the role of transmission of knowledge. I'm really interested in whether people were interested in that bit of Aristotle about it when he says that the animals meet together at the watering holes and they breed together because they get friendly, and you get all these weird animals. This happens in Africa, and everything fantastic happens in Africa. You get women who give birth to 30 children, and you know, so there is some of the things that are more elaborated later. Some of those have little seeds in Aristotle. I wondered if they were reading that.
The reception of Aristotle, you mean? Yes, yes. I think Dasen knows that well, because the discourse in Latin, Lucretius and others are related to this reception of Aristotle.
Yeah, I suppose Pliny is.
Yes, yes. But
Yeah.
we are very struck reading him, how careful, how smart are the observation, as you said rightly. I mean, hybrid do exist, but that's why he says, not as you think. It's not the elephant boy. It's something else. Very cleverly, he introduces all these categories. And that's why he's the real founder really, of teratology, that influenced then Latin writers as well. Yeah, so he was, yes, read. Thank you.
And Karina?
Yeah, hello. Karina Weiss from Würzburg. I'm a GEM person. And I thank you, Véronique, for all this rich material you gave us. And I wanted to stress more or less the apotropaic value. When you have the possession of such a strange object or a body or an animal, you have a part of that power that's in it. And I think that's one of the most important thing, not so much curiosity, that is one hand, but the other hand is to get it and to have it as a protection shield. I wanted to remember you the white pig from Lavinium, which came in, when I remember it really good, in a salt solution to Rome, and it was shown there. And having this was quite like having a piece of Pignora Romana.
You're absolutely right. And it is even the definition of what is a probascania. If you want to avert the evil eye, and Plutarch says it, you must wear something strange.
Yes, yes.
Evil eye will look at the something strange and not at you. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this is a very interesting point, because we could wonder, why do you have such cameo? Do you wear such cameo? Are you a woman? Are you a man? What is the reason? And you very rightly stress the possibility that it's to as a protection as well. So
we've got time for 2 more questions. If anyone wants to ask or type one. Veronique, just a brief question. So many things to ask, but I'm haunted by this hammering the big head reference. And I was reading the English translation says that it could be bitten. But looking at the Greek text, I think we can definitely translate it as it was bitten, right? We have this esphyrokoupon. So the text, as we translate it, describes something that was taking place almost. And that made me think about the idea of all these weird things. Usually what you do is you stare at them, you're not supposed to touch them. And that idea of hammering here, it made me think of a more interactive, more haptic engagement with all this stuff. Which is kind of cool. You won't touch this stuff when you see it, and no one allows you. So this esphyrokoupon, I mean, it looks brilliant.
very interesting.
Whatever it means, yeah, whatever it means. But anyhow.
Anyway, a child, because half a cubit high it's a child with a colossal head. We think, of course, of hydrocephaly, and though we must be careful with doing retro diagnosis, this is quite likely. This is not something impossible. This exists. It exists, and it could be lethal, and that's why the child would have died. Now, what is extraordinary, because here we have names of those doing the job. And that's why it is interesting. Otherwise, we know it was preserved in honey, it arrived in Rome, it was whatever. And here we know who did it. And so now we can point why it was in Alexandria. The Triton and the Hippocentor interest me because it's a more difficult job to do them. It's much more difficult, especially the Triton. But we have seen the Fiji mermaid. But which milieu could create such things?
Yeah.
Going from the body itself as it is, maybe for study purpose, as Dorotheus, who wants to keep the memory as it is. He doesn't want to have a bricolage. He wants just to have the specimen, and this one too. But he's in the hands of embalmers, and that's also a bit strange.
Yeah,
making money, probably making money with it.
And we've got a final question. I'm gonna read it. It's been typed. So Demos is asking if we have any evidence that any of these mirabilia were ever treated by their contemporaries as artifacts that belonged in an art horror narrative, and if they were appreciated as such. So we talked about aesthetics, right? But is it, I mean, do you think we have enough evidence to be trying more specific kind of assumption that?
I'm personally fascinated by these gardens. Personally, I wish so much I could travel in time and walk around and see what was to be found in these gardens. Zara Newby has a very interesting chapter about gardens, display of violence through myth, you know, these statues, the death of Niobe and so on. Very interesting paper. It's even a chapter now of a book. And when I realized that the sleeping hermaphroditus was coming from the same place, it gives you a clue that you had an aesthetical pleasure at the same time as you wonder, you also want to see it in detail, to look at it. And it's part of the same, yes, the same view.
So at this point, we're 7:30. So would like to thank you all, Véronique, Dasen, and everybody. Thanks again.
Thank you.
And we'll see you, Maria, next.
Listen to Idris Khalid's talk about ancient Cyprus, medicine in ancient Cyprus.
Okay, so bye everyone, and
bye.
Next month.
Bye.
Thank you again so much.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, Maria. It was lovely. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's always a bit difficult when we, it's a bit acrobatic, but it's okay.
No, you know what, Véronique? I mean, you do all the archaeology stuff as well, but if you're more text, you know, if you only read literature and literary sources, like I do, you have a limited perspective. You know, all these things about the gardens and the archaeological stuff and the landscape, they're so integral to this question. And I mean, you definitely need to take them into account. I mean, what you said now about the hermaphrodite and this violent thing and the gardens, I mean, it's amazing. Do you think, Véronique, that there was a kind of also elitist attitude against this kind of stuff? I mean, Plutarch,
I didn't go the passage because it was too long, but Seneca, for instance, I like so much what he says. It is on my slides, but I can maybe read it again. He says that his wife bought a dwarf or to clown. And he said, why does she do that? Is it for fun? If I want to laugh, I can just laugh of myself. I love it. It's so nice. So that's the attitude. That's the Roman attitude. And that's why I find fascinating the position of Augustus. He's really between two worlds. He wants to posit himself as an emperor. And so he takes the influx from Alexandria, and so he shows rhinoceros, amazing snakes. He does it. So he does it as they do in Ptolemaic Egypt and so on. And at the same time, he has this reserve towards privately playing with nice children. He doesn't like the dwarfs that really belong to this other world. And Mark Antony, that's why it's interesting in Philodemus, because Mark Antony precisely has the dwarfs. I didn't show us the slides, but we have little extract, Horace and others who say that indeed Sisyphus and so on. So he's following the Alexandrian taste.
Yeah.
No surprise. That's no surprise.
Yeah.
But so there was a resistance, and Seneca. Yes, that's ad Lucilium. Ad Lucilium 5. You know, Harpaste, my wife, female's clown, and she's a burden. I disapprove this freak. So he says it with prodigium. He speaks of prodigium. Whenever I wish to enjoy a clown, I'm not compelled to hunt so far. I can laugh of myself.
Yeah. Can we position the freak shows, let's say, as part of what the Romans described as luxuria? And that's why you have Seneca reacting, because it's, reacting towards this concept, because, and again, Seneca representing this stoic attitude towards luxury and everything that comes, let's say, paraphysine, and he's presenting the natural life. And I guess the role of the gardens also is part of this luxuria and
they were amazing, these gardens. When you look at the surface, it's huge. That's why I spoke of Disneyland, but it's not just a joke. They had many surprises, also the statues, the architecture. It was highly luxurious. And Lucullus, well, come on, Lucullus comes back as a general. He brings back to Rome many culinary novelties, such as the cherries, and the cherry tree comes with Lucullus. So it is just that. Of course, it's all in one. So it represents also the luxury. But and this is what I wanted also to show. It's not just that. There is also in parallel with this move. There is also this I don't like the word progress, but a transformation of knowledge through the preservations of these bodies. But we hardly hear about them. That's why Dorotheus interests me very much, because this guy did something that was recorded, and if there is one, there are more. And that's why Galen interests me too, because there is more to say, but they don't speak about it. Maybe it's the secret of the guild, of the association of doctors, and you don't really speak about it. So it is in parallel, as it has always been. In fact, that's what I wanted to show. So it is from the antiquity until today, there are always different currents coexisting. And even today, we think we are in the 21st century and very rational when we have QAnon people, and so we are total irrational, and it's amazing. It's even very striking. You think, well, come on, how can you deny pandemia and say it doesn't exist? So it shows that it depends all of a circle. Who are you talking about? And this since antiquity. So there is no divide, antiquity, then another period, because you still find that in books. And it is just a linear view, evolutionary view, which does not work.
Yeah, I agree. I think I agree. Yeah. Thank you so much, Véronique. Thank you.
I hope we keep in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. And good luck with all the million stuff you're doing.
about. And
Well, yeah.
do ask me if you need something from me. For instance, all the work we publish now with the ERC must be online. Sometimes I have an embargo of 1 year, which is fair, frankly, for publishers. But if you need something, also we scan many things. We should have global libraries. PDF.
Oh yeah. It's a very good opportunity. This Zoom thing. Let's make the most out of it. Yeah.
But do not hesitate to ask if you need something from me. Huh?
Thank you. We appreciate it.
You too.
Thank you, Véronique.
Bye-bye. Have a nice evening.
Έλα, Παπαμάρκο.
Καλησπέρα.